Well, according to the Washington Post, special counsel Robert Mueller is now investigating President Donald Trump for possible obstruction of justice. Citing unnamed sources, the Post reports that Trump asked Director of National Intelligence Daniel Coats if he could get the FBI to back off its investigation of Michael Flynn. Flynn is Trump's former national security advisor who resigned shortly after the administration took power. On Friday, the president tweeted this, saying, "I'm being investigated for firing the FBI director by the man who told me to fire the FBI director. Witchhunt." Now, that appears to be a reference to Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, and the man who hired Mueller. However, it was later reported that a source close to Trump says that the tweet was not a confirmation of the investigation, merely a response to the Washington Post story. Now, as always, there is a lot to unpack here, so let's discuss this with our U.S. political panel in Washington. Paul Brandis runs West Wing Reports and is a columnist with USA Today, and Molly McHugh, a foreign policy and strategy consultant. Thank you for making time for us.
How are you?
Paul, let's start with you. How surprising is it here that we're seeing the U.S. president now being possibly included in this investigation?
I don't think, RT, that we should be surprised at all. I mean, everything that we're talking about here revolves around Donald Trump, and in his world, power is the truth, the way he sees it. He can't believe that these independent investigators are looking at him. I think he continues to act as if he's sort of the CEO of a privately held company where he can do whatever he wants, and he's always surprised, shocked when in the government it doesn't work that way, and people resist him and talk back and push back. So I think that's why we see these tweets. We've seen reports of him yelling at televisions in the White House when some news reports talk about things that he doesn't want to hear. We should not be surprised at all that all of this is coming back to the president, not at all.
And now, Molly, I wanted to go to you, too, about the language that we're seeing in this tweet. He used the term witch hunt, and he's used this comparison before. We've seen it in a lot of his tweets. He uses these buzzwords. Who is he sort of tapping into, and is there any merit to this claim? He feels like he's been under fire since, before his campaign, before the inauguration, after the inauguration. What do we make of the tweeting? How challenging does that make it, and what is he trying to get at?
Well, I think you're right. I think this is a president who feels under attack. I think he is justified in feeling he is under attack because he clearly is. He is the focus of many of these ongoing investigations sort of swirling around him. And he's not doing himself any favors, one, with the tweets and sort of fanning the flames of the speculation, and two, by continuing to ignore the real problem underlying all of this, which is, of course, Russia, which was remarkably absent from any of the discussions of the Trump-Russia scandal. And there's a lot there to unpack, but I think on the tweets specifically, on the language he's using, this is classic Donald Trump. There were new polls that came out in the last few days. He has a 64% disapproval rating as president, which is, I think, historically high. And he knows that. And so what he's looking at is the 34% that doesn't hate him. And that is where Twitter is his tool. He fans the sort of fervor of his most supportive base using these kinds of information tools and tactics. And he's going to keep on doing it because he believes that's what's going to keep him in the White House.
Now, Paul, let's go back to that tweet for a second. He didn't actually name names, but it appeared that he was taking aim at the deputy AG, at Rod Rosenstein. So what do we make of that? I mean, what is he trying to do with that? Where is he trying to go with that?
Well, everybody knows who he's talking about, RT, and to take a page from the Trump playbook, this is what he does. He tends to distort and distract and deny. And he's just simply trying to divert attention from the central focus of what these Justice Department and FBI investigators are zeroing in on: Trump's behavior, his collusion, if any, with Russia. And it's fair to point out, by the way, that so far there's no smoking gun with regard to all of this. Even top Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee say that. They do say, however, that there's a lot of smoke, but no smoking gun. So it's important to make that distinction. But to Molly's point, I think that's exactly what the president is doing. He understands that he is deeply unpopular. He's only been president for 5 months. These poll numbers are just horrible, but he has about a third of the country, maybe a little bit more according to certain other polls, where his support appears to be still pretty good. Well, when I say pretty good, it's pretty good among Republicans. 75, 80% of Republicans still support him, but I think the thing for him to worry about are these independents, the folks in the middle who swung his way in November. They are beginning to edge away from him. I think that's what he has to worry about. Again, his support is strong with Republicans, weakening with independents, and of course, horrible with the Democrats.
And really, there have been sort of a number of fiascos, so to speak. Now, we saw the Attorney General had to recuse himself back to the Russia probe. And now there are these reports that there might be a partial recusal or perhaps full recusal of Rosenstein as well. So what do we make of that? How, Molly, would that change this probe if Rosenstein is called as a witness and then has to recuse himself as well?
I think this will continue happening. I think it is a strategy partially from the Trump team to sort of make sure that the investigations are on uncertain footing, that there's going to be these constant changes, that they have these talking points to use with their base about these things being politically motivated and not driven by fact, and everybody has to recuse themselves, and it's all a mess. I think we'll see efforts from the administration to continue to discredit those that are involved in the investigation, as they have been doing with Bob Mueller, as they tried to do with James Comey. I think that in this case, if Rosenstein has to recuse himself, there's probably reasons for that relating to the Comey firing. That would probably actually be valid. But I think whoever, and I forget the name of the individual, but whoever is behind him in the Justice Department who would be coming up to fill that chair for the time being wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I don't think anybody who is credible or career-oriented within the Justice Department is going to let this be shoved into a drawer somewhere. There's a lot of different parts of this investigation. There's the parts about the campaign. There's the parts about what Russia is doing. There's a lot of different things going on, and these are not going to go away. And I think even no matter how much the president would like to believe removing an individual or removing a specific person or removing a specific question is going to close this investigation, that's not going to happen. This is a multi-agency process. It's not just the Justice Department. It's across the administration. And there are a lot of people who are very animated about figuring out what Russia has done to the United States of America, which is the part that the president still will not discuss, which is I thought the most interesting thing of the Comey testimony last week was this point that in the now 6 months since the president was first briefed on the intelligence community's report on Russia's efforts to influence the American election, the president has never asked about it and never asked what we can do to stop it.
And there's so much that we could continue to talk about on this particular story, but we're going to move to another story because there's always so much to discuss. So let's talk about Donald Trump and Cuba. He's announced a new era in US-Cuba relations, speaking to a boisterous crowd of supporters. Trump criticized the deal reached by then-President Barack Obama more than 2 years ago.
The outcome of last administration's executive action has been only more repression and a move to crush the peaceful democratic movement. Therefore, effective immediately, I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba.
Now, we've heard some people describe that announcement somewhat as symbolic because Trump's actions don't totally negate the deal Obama made, but it does place new restrictions on travel, and it will restrict U.S. companies from doing business with Cuban enterprises controlled by the military. The move aims to stop U.S. money heading to Cuba's military. So now, Molly, how significant is what he announced yesterday?
I mean, look, this was politics. This was a great big ball of politics. You have Trump flying to Miami to speak to basically Miami Cubans, which is a very specific portion of the sort of Cuban emigre community. And it's a very small part of the Republican vote, but this was a very political announcement. This was, again, I'm undoing Obama's legacy. I'm getting the U.S. a better deal. This is what this is about. And underneath it, there's just a lot of air. I think it's such a strange thing for him to pick, and you sort of wonder who was the person who sort of put it in front of him and said, this is going to be the thing that you need to talk about to get 0.2% of the vote back or something. But it's just very odd. The whole rhetoric of it, this is a policy, the sort of thawing of Cuban relations is a policy that Americans are broadly supportive of, not because they believe that the Cuban regime has improved or is any better than it used to be, but because they believe that the presence presence of the United States of America in Cuba will do more good in terms of changing the forward momentum of the country than not. Now, restricting money going to the Cuban military is great, is fine. That's a good point it's a good thing to point out should have been adjusted and something we should pay attention to in many countries. But this deployment from the president of this very Cold War rhetoric about Cuba, where nobody really cares what the heck is going on, where it's totally absent from actual enemies of the United States of America who are attacking our country right now, is just so bizarre. And suddenly we care about democracy and human rights in Cuba, in our own hemisphere, but only there and nowhere else, where he has specifically said he will not talk about these things when visiting Saudi Arabia and talking about Russia. It's proof that there's very little center to the president's policies. They're driven by politics, they're driven by individuals asking him to do favors, and I think that's going to continue to be a problem for him.
And as you said, somewhat of a political opportunity, because really
Absolutely.
not a whole lot changed. The embassy remains open in Havana. Not a lot of the travel restrictions are very widespread. We know that U.S. carriers will still be going there, cruise ships, etc. Now, Paul, to you, Trump said the new policies will remain in place until Cuba releases political prisoners, stops abusing dissidents, and to Molly's point as well, respects freedom of expression. So, Paul, can Trump actually put effective pressure on Cuba to change? Is this going to work?
Well, it's really funny how it calls it sort of a new policy. It's just the old policy that we had since the Eisenhower and Kennedy eras 55 years ago. So I don't really see what's new about it. And look, for a president who wants to get the shackles off of American businesses so they can trade and do business and so forth, to impose restrictions on them with regard to Cuba seems kind of counterproductive to everything that he talks about. And if you've been to Cuba, look where I'm on. I'm on Canadian television. Canadian businesses, German businesses, and so forth are all over Cuba right now, and we are not. So it's these American businesses that are really being hurt by his policy here. And I think Molly was right when he said, look, he's just playing politics to get this small sliver of Cuban-American votes in Florida, a state that he won not by very much last November. I think that's what this is all about. But look, relitigating the Cold War, I think is just kind of a silly strategy in this business of talking tough to dictators. Look, he was just dancing the sword dance in Saudi Arabia, and he's praised Erdogan and Turkey and says it would be an honor to sit down with North Korea's Kim and so forth. So I just don't understand this policy here. It's just kind of a, one thing one day, one thing another day kind of approach.
Now, quickly, Molly, I did want from you, you did touch on this, asking the question, who is advising him to do this? Because it was widely approved, that move of the warming relations. So will this move alienate some Trump supporters? And we're talking about American businesses as well, not being able to operate or work with Cuban industry as well. So is he alienating supporters?
I don't think that this is going to push the business community away from him. I do think it's that they will not be supportive of this move. I think American business for a long time has been eager to get back into Cuba. As Paul said, there has been a thaw from just about everywhere else, especially Europeans, Canadians, and others. In terms of Cuba, it's a big market. It's right outside of America. And we should be there. We should be shaping that space. And when we're not there, the people pushing into that vacuum, there's a lot of Russian money going in. There's a lot of Chinese money going in. We can't leave these environments open for influence from others and not understand holistically what we're looking at. I do think the American business community will sort of quietly back channel to the president and say, hey, let's think about how we're doing this. I don't think it'll push any of them away from him, but I don't think they're going to be supportive of this particularly.
All right, now we're going to hit pause on the conversation just for a moment, but there's plenty more to discuss.